The barn had always been a place of silence, of comfort, of whispered secrets from childhood when she would slip away from the loud world and hide among the hay bales. But that evening, the silence felt different. It wasn't refuge anymore. It was heavy, suffocating, wrapping around her like a shroud. The scent of hay, of leather, of earth and animals usually brought her peace. Now, it only reminded her of everything she had lost. She stood near the back wall, half hidden by an old wooden beam, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as though she could keep her heart from breaking apart. Her dress was simple, the hem stained with dirt from working the ranch yard earlier that day. Her boots were scuffed, her hair loose around her face. She hadn't meant to cry, not here, not like this. But the pain was too much, and when it came like a storm. Her knees gave out beneath her, and she sank to the rough wooden floor. The tears came hot and uncontrollable, streaming down her cheeks and dripping onto the planks. They left dark marks that quickly absorbed into the wood, disappearing, as though even the barn itself swallowed her grief. Each tear carried fragments of her past. Her father's laugh, once the heart of the ranch, now gone forever. The sound of the auctioneer's voice when the land was parceled off piece by piece to pay debts. The cold eyes of her stepmother, who had never hidden her disdain. The endless, gnawing loneliness of having no one who cared if she smiled or wept. Her sobs echoed faintly against the barn walls, carried by the hollow emptiness of the space. Outside, the world was alive with the chorus of crickets, the lowing of cattle in the pastures, the rustling wind that tugged at the barn doors. But inside, she was trapped in her own sorrow, as if the barn itself had become a vessel for all her pain. She pressed her palms to her eyes, as though she could stop the tears, but it only made them come faster. Her chest heaved with the effort of breathing, and the sound of her own brokenness filled her ears. For a long moment, she believed no one would ever find her, and perhaps, she thought bitterly, no one would care if they did. But then she heard it, the crunch of boots against straw. Slow, steady, deliberate. At first she thought she was imagining it, that her mind had conjured up some phantom to break the unbearable silence. But the sound grew closer. Her head snapped up, her breath caught in her throat. She tried to compose herself quickly, swiping at her cheeks, but the red in her eyes and the trembling in her hands betrayed her. She turned her face away, desperate not to be seen so raw, so weak. The footsteps stopped just a few feet away. Then came the low scrap of wood as someone adjusted their stance. A shadow stretched across the barn floor. "Why are you hiding out here, darling?" The voice was deep, calm, and unmistakable. Her heart leapt painfully in her chest. Jacob. He was the kind of man whose presence always seemed to fill a room or a barn, in this chassis without him ever needing to raise his voice. Tall, broad-shouldered, sunburnt from years of labor under the prairie skies, he carried the quiet authority of someone who had weathered more storms than he could count. He wasn't just rancher, he was the rancher, the one everyone in town respected. Some feared him for his blunt honesty, but those who truly knew him trusted him without question. And now, here he was, standing over her with those sharp eyes of his, softened by lantern light and shadow. His hat was tilted back, revealing the rugged lines of his face, the faint scar at his jaw from a long-ago accident, the faintest hint of concern etched into his expression. She scrambled to her feet, wiping at her face again, but the effort was pointless. Her tears betrayed her. Her voice caught in her throat, refusing to form words. Jacob took a slow step closer, his boots pressing into the straw with a crunch that echoed in her bones. His movements were deliberate, as though he didn't want to startle her. "Didn't mean to scare ya," he said gently. Saw the door open. Figured something wasn't right. She shook her head, still unable to speak. She wanted to tell him to leave, to walk away, to let her drown in her grief unseen. But at the same time, a small, fragile part of her, the part that still remembered what hope felt like, he longed for him to stay. Her silence spoke louder than any words could have. Jacob let out a slow breath. He reached up, adjusting his hat before taking another step toward her. This time, when he was close enough, he lifted a hand and let it hover, hesitating, before resting it lightly on her arm. His touch was firm, grounding, yet tender in a way that made her heart ache. "You've carried too much alone," he murmured. His voice was quiet but carried a weight, like the steady rumble of thunder rolling across the plains. And I can't stand to see it eating you alive. She closed her eyes, biting her lip to keep another sob from escaping, but it broke free anyway, muffled against her hand. Jacob didn't flinch. He didn't recoil from her tears. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence wrapping around her like a shelter from the storm. His hand slid down her arm until his calloused fingers gently closed around her wrist, not to restrain her, but to steady her. "You'll never cry alone again," he said firmly. "Not while I'm here." The words struck her like lightning. She opened her eyes, wide and startled, searching his face for any trace of insincerity. But all she found was truth, plain and simple, carved into the lines of his weather-worn features. For a moment, the barn seemed to shift around them. The shadows receded, the silence softened, and the weight on her chest lightened just enough for her to draw a deeper breath. She didn't know why he cared. She didn't know if she deserved it. But as his hand held hers, she felt something she hadn't in a long time seen. The tears still fell, warm and unstoppable, but they no longer felt like the tears of someone drowning. They were different now. They were the tears of someone finally beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't invisible after all. The barn, once cold and suffocating, seemed to breathe again. The lantern flickered softly, casting golden light across Jacob's face. The animals shifted in their stalls, calmer now, as though even they sensed the change in the air. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was enough. And Jacob, the man who rarely wasted words, seemed to understand. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, then let it go. But he didn't step back. Instead, he stayed beside her, quiet and steady, a presence she hadn't known she needed until now. In that moment, surrounded by hay and shadow and the faint scent of earth, her world shifted. It wasn't healed, not yet. The grief was still there, raw and deep, but it no longer felt endless, because someone had found her. Someone had seen her tears, and instead of turning away, he had promised her something she had thought impossible, that she would never have to cry alone again. The morning after that night in the barn, she woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the faint rumble of cattle lowing in the distance. The sunlight streamed through her small window, painting golden stripes across the quilt she clutched tightly around her. For a long time, she simply lay still, staring at the ceiling, replaying Jacob's words in her head. "You'll never cry alone again, not while I'm here." She almost wished she could dismiss them as kindness spoken in a moment of pity, but they had sounded too steady, too deliberate, to be thrown away so lightly. They had settled deep in her chest like a seed waiting to grow. That day, when she stepped outside, the ranch felt both familiar and different. The sky stretched wide and endless, blue as a river of glass. The prairie grass swayed in the wind, carrying the earthy scent of soil and horses. She saw Jacob from a distance, saddling up his chestnut mare. His movements were steady, practiced, yet he turned when he sensed her watching. Their eyes met across the yard. He tipped his hat in her direction, a small, wordless gesture, but it was enough to send warmth curling through her. For the first time in months, maybe years, she didn't feel like a ghost haunting her own life. Jacob didn't press her to talk. Instead, he wove himself quietly into her days. He began with small gestures, leaving a steaming cup of coffee on the porch before sunrise, setting aside a portion of fresh bread at supper, tightening the straps on her saddle so she wouldn't have to struggle with it alone. At first, she wanted to protest. She didn't want to need anyone. Needing meant depending, and depending meant risking disappointment. But Jacob never asked for thanks, never demanded anything in return. His presence was like the steady hum of the wind across the plains, a constant, unshakable, and strangely comforting. One evening, they sat on the fence overlooking the pasture. The sky was ablaze with sunset colors, deep orange, violet, and the faintest streak of crimson. The cattle grazed lazily in the fading light. Jacob leaned against the rail, his hat low over his brow. "You ever notice," he said slowly, "how the land keeps breath in, no matter what storms come?" She glanced at him, puzzled. He nodded toward the horizon. "Storms tear through here something fierce," he continued. "Break fences, drown fields, leave nothing but mud. But give it time, and the grass grows back. The earth don't quit. It just a broken bar heals itself." Little by little, she swallowed hard. His words weren't really about the land, and they both knew it. Her throat tightened as tears pricked her eyes again. She looked away quickly, ashamed of how easily they came. Jacob didn't call attention to it. He didn't offer hollow reassurances. Instead, he reached over and placed his hand lightly over hers where it rested on the fence. His palm was rough, his fingers strong, but his touch was gentle. "You ain't broken," he murmured. "You're just healing, same as the land." For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Her heart ached with the weight of all the words she wanted to say but couldn't. She simply nodded, gripping his hand back as though it were the only solid thing in her world. As weeks passed, she began to notice things she hadn't before. The laughter of the ranch hands carried across the yard, and instead of stinging her with loneliness, it made her smile faintly. The horses seemed calmer around her, as though they sensed the shift in her spirit. Even the barn, once a place of sorrow, became a space where she felt safe again because now, when she entered, she remembered not just her tears, but Jacob's promise. But healing wasn't a straight road. There were nights when nightmares clawed their way into her sleep, dragging her back to memories she wished she could bury. She would wake in the dark, gasping, trembling, tears soaking her pillow. On those nights, she thought of slipping into the barn again, but before she could, there would be a knock at her door. Jacob never pushed his way in. He would stand there quietly, lantern in hand, his eyes steady as if he already knew. "You don't have to talk," he'd say softly. "Just a broken bar, let me sit a while." And he would, sometimes in silence, sometimes telling slow stories about calving seasons, stubborn mules, or the time he nearly got thrown into the river by a bull. His deep voice rumbled like a lullaby, grounding her until her breathing slowed and the shadows loosened their grip. One night, after he finished a story, she whispered, almost without thinking, "Why do you care so much?" Jacob tilted his head, studying her with those piercing eyes that seemed to see right through every wall she tried to build. "'Cause I know what it's like," he said at last. His voice was low, almost rough. "Lost my ma when I was just a boy. My pa broken bar, he didn't know how to handle it. Took it out on me more ways than I care to remember. For a long time, I thought I wasn't worth nothing. Thought nobody'd ever see me either. Till someone did. A ranch hand, old fellow. Didn't say much, but he stuck by me. Made sure I knew I wasn't alone. Guess I'm just returning the favor." Her heart clenched. She had never heard him speak so personally before, and the honesty in his words cracked something open inside her. "The broken bar, I'm sorry," she whispered. He shook his head gently. "Don't be. We all got storms. What matters is whether we let each other drown in AM or pull each other out." His gaze held hers, steady and unflinching, until she had to look away, her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't yet name. The seasons began to change. Summer bled into autumn, the fields turning gold, the evenings growing crisp. With every passing week, she found herself leaning more into Jacob's presence. She began to laugh again, hesitant at first, then freer. She caught herself humming while sweeping the porch or tending to the horses. Jacob noticed. Sometimes she'd find him watching her quietly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips, as though her healing was something sacred he had the honor to witness. But there were moments, too, when she wondered if she was leaning too much, if she was becoming a burden. One chilly evening, while gathering firewood, she finally voiced it. "Jacob," she said softly, "you've done so much for me, more than I deserve. Aren't you tired of carrying someone else's broken pieces?" He set down the bundle of wood he was holding and turned to her, his expression serious. "Darling," he said firmly, "you're not a burden. You're not broken pieces. You're a whole person who's been hurt. That's all. And I ain't carrying you, I'm walking beside you." Big difference. Her eyes stung with tears again, but this time, they weren't just from sorrow. They were from something gentler, deeper. Gratitude, hope, maybe even the first fragile threads of love. One night, as the first frost silvered the grass, she found herself back in the barn. This time, she wasn't hiding. She was standing by the stall of a restless horse, soothing it with gentle strokes. Jacob entered quietly, lantern in hand, just as he had that first night. But when he saw her, he smiled, not with concern, but with pride. "Looks like this old barn's seen a change," he said softly. She turned, meeting his gaze. "So have I." Jacob stepped closer, setting the lantern on a beam. The light flickered between them, casting their shadows high on the wooden walls. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't heavy this time, yet it was full, alive, humming with the unspoken. Finally, Jacob reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch lingered, warm against her skin. "You'll never cry alone again," he repeated, the same words from that first night, but now they carried even more weight. This time, she didn't shy away. She let herself lean into his hand, her heart steady where once it had only known trembling. And in the quiet of the barn, with the scent of hay and the whisper of wind outside, she realized that the seed Jacob had planted in her that night had taken root. She wasn't healed completely. She still had scars, still carried shadows, but now, she had something else too, someone who had chosen to see her, to stand by her, to remind her with every steady word and touch that storms didn't last forever. For the first time in her life, she believed it, and she knew, deep in her soul, that she would never again face her tears in solitude. Not while Jacob was there.